The Andes Mountains rise like jagged spines across South America, their peaks shrouded in mist and mystery, a landscape both breathtaking and unforgiving. For centuries, these towering heights have been home to isolated tribes, communities that thrived far from the reach of empires and explorers. Among them was a tribe whose story has haunted historians, anthropologists, and adventurers alike. A tribe known not only for its fierce warriors, but also for a practice that sent shivers down the spines of those who first heard of it. They were the keepers of a dark ritual, one that involved consuming the flesh of their enemies, a practice wrapped in spiritual reverence, fear, and survival. To modern ears, it sounds unthinkable, almost grotesque, a taboo that defies morality. Yet, for this tribe, it was an expression of honor, vengeance, and connection to the dead, a ritual embedded deeply in their worldview. Imagine a misty valley at dawn, the sun barely piercing through a thick veil of clouds, the cold air biting at the skin, and the only sounds being the distant cries of birds and the soft rush of a river. In this remote expanse, life was a constant negotiation with the elements. Survival was never guaranteed. Food was scarce, winters were merciless, and rival tribes were a constant threat. Within this crucible of isolation and struggle, human behavior takes on forms that outsiders might label barbaric. Yet for those who lived it, these actions were calculated, meaningful, and profoundly ritualistic. The tribe's cannibalistic feasts were not born of mindless cruelty. They were acts that reinforced social cohesion, punished enemies, and honored the dead in ways that were incomprehensible to anyone outside their culture. Accounts of these feasts first reached the outside world through explorers and missionaries, men and women whose lives had been touched by curiosity, ambition, or the desire to civilize what they considered savage lands. Their journals tell stories both fascinating and horrifying. They spoke of ceremonies that involved drums, chants, and the meticulous preparation of a fallen enemy's body. The descriptions are chilling, but they reveal something more than mere violence. They reveal a worldview where death and the consumption of flesh were intertwined with spiritual power. These outsiders, constrained by their own morality and belief systems, could not fathom the logic, the reverence, or the cultural significance behind what they witnessed. They wrote of horror, but they also wrote of awe, a conflicted fascination that would shape the narrative of the tribe for centuries. It is easy to judge from a distance. It is easy to label these people as monsters, to sensationalize their practices in ways that strip them of nuance. Yet, the more one studies these histories, the more complex the picture becomes. The tribe lived in a world where survival often demanded actions that were extreme, where ritual was a framework for order and meaning, and where the line between life and death was not merely a biological fact, but a spiritual continuum. Eating an enemy was not simply about nourishment. It was about absorbing their strength, honoring their bravery in death, and sending a message to others that the tribe was united, unyielding, and spiritually potent. In essence, every act of consumption was a statement of identity, a reaffirmation of community values, and a warning to those who might threaten them. In modern times, such stories are often told in whispers, in documentaries, or in books that promise shock and sensationalism. But behind the allure of horror lies a fundamental question about human nature. How far can belief, fear, and survival instincts shape behavior? What does it mean when a society normalizes what outsiders would call monstrous acts? And how do these practices reflect the broader struggles of life in extreme environments, where the harshness of nature and the inevitability of death demand extraordinary responses? These are not questions with easy answers, but they are questions that invite curiosity, fascination, and even a reluctant empathy for people who lived under circumstances so alien to our own. The Andes themselves become characters in this story, not merely a backdrop. Their cliffs, valleys, and hidden plateaus shaped the lives of those who inhabited them. The isolation fostered a culture of secrecy and resilience, where outsiders rarely ventured and the tribe's rituals remained protected from prying eyes. Every feast, every ceremonial act, took place within a landscape that was as unforgiving as it was majestic. Survival required cunning, cooperation, and an intimate understanding of the land's rhythms. It was within this crucible that the tribe's cannibalistic rituals evolved, gaining layers of spiritual significance and social importance that would mystify and horrify anyone who observed them without context. As the story unfolds, it becomes clear that this is not a tale merely about horror or violence. It is a tale about humanity at its extremes, about the lengths people will go to preserve identity, community, and belief. It is about fear and courage, life and death, reverence and transgression. In studying this tribe, one is forced to confront uncomfortable truths about morality, cultural relativism, and the human capacity for both empathy and brutality. The cannibal feasts are shocking, yes, but they are also a window into a complex, adaptive, and profoundly human response to a world defined by scarcity, danger, and the ever-present shadow of mortality. Tonight, as we journey into this shadowed past, we will walk alongside those who witnessed the unimaginable, who chronicled the terrifying beauty of rituals designed to honor the dead, and who struggled to reconcile horror with fascination. We will explore not only the acts themselves, but also the beliefs, the psychology, and the survival imperatives that made such acts not only possible, but integral to a way of life. By the end, you will see the Andes not only as mountains of stone and ice, but as living landscapes that shaped human behavior in ways as stark, haunting, and extraordinary as the feasts they concealed. The story of this tribe is a reminder that history is rarely clean or simple. It is messy, dark, and full of contradictions. And it is within these contradictions that we find the most compelling tales, the ones that linger in the mind long after the lights are dimmed. The cannibal feasts of the Andes are not just stories of horror. They are stories of survival, belief, identity, and the extremes of what it means to be human. As we descend into the valleys, follow the trails carved by these people, and witness the rituals that have haunted history. Prepare yourself for a journey into darkness, a confrontation with fear, and an exploration of humanity at its most extreme. The tribe that carried out these infamous cannibal feasts did not exist in a vacuum. They were shaped by centuries of isolation, by the unforgiving geography of the Andes, and by a complex web of beliefs, traditions, and survival imperatives that defined every aspect of their lives. To understand the shocking rituals they practiced, one must first understand the world they inhabited, a world defined by both scarcity and spiritual depth, a world in which every act had meaning, and every death resonated beyond the physical plane. The Andes themselves are a formidable teacher. Rugged peaks soar into thin air, valleys are carved with icy rivers, and plateaus stretch across seemingly endless distances. For the tribe, this environment demanded adaptability, resourcefulness, and an intimate understanding of the land. Hunting and foraging were daily necessities, not pastimes, and the harsh climate shaped the rhythms of life. Winters were long and brutal, and the threat of starvation or attack from neighboring groups was constant. This precarious existence forged a culture that celebrated strength, cunning, and loyalty, while simultaneously fostering deep spiritual reverence for forces beyond human control. Central to the tribe's worldview was a profound connection to the dead. They believed that the spirits of those who had passed on remained active in the world of the living, capable of influencing fortune, fertility, and warfare. Honoring the deceased was not merely a gesture of respect, but an essential ritual to maintain cosmic balance and ensure the tribe's continued survival. In this context, the cannibalistic feasts assumed a deeper meaning. They were not acts of indiscriminate violence. They were ceremonies designed to absorb the strength of worthy enemies, to honor the courage of fallen foes, and to symbolically incorporate the spiritual power of those who had died. Every detail, the timing, the preparation, the participants, was carefully controlled, governed by generations of ritual knowledge and a shared belief system that transcended simple notions of right or wrong. Social hierarchy within the tribe was another critical element. Leadership was earned through courage in battle, wisdom in ritual, and skill in survival. Elders were revered not only for their age, but for their understanding of the sacred laws that governed life and death. Young warriors trained rigorously, learning hunting techniques, combat strategies, and ritual procedures. Success in these domains conferred status, while failure could bring shame or even death. The cannibal feasts, therefore, also served as displays of power and cohesion. They reinforced social bonds, rewarded bravery, and reminded both members and outsiders that the tribe's survival depended on unity, discipline, and unwavering respect for tradition. Conflict with neighboring tribes was a frequent and dangerous reality. Resources were scarce, and territorial disputes could quickly escalate into violent confrontations. In this environment, the ritualistic consumption of enemies was both practical and symbolic. Practically, it removed a threat while providing nourishment. Symbolically, it demonstrated dominance, punished betrayal, and asserted spiritual authority. Outsiders who witnessed these practices often described a combination of horror and awe. What might appear as barbarism to one observer was, in the eyes of the tribe, a sophisticated system of honor, power, and spiritual continuity. The feasts were as much about morality and justice as they were about survival, a paradox that confounded those who tried to understand it through the lens of European morality. The tribe's mythology further explains the rationale behind their practices. Legends passed down through oral tradition told of ancestors who had harnessed spiritual energy through the consumption of enemies, who had protected their communities from famine and invasion by incorporating the essence of their foes. These stories were not mere entertainment. They were moral and practical lessons encoded in narrative form. They taught the young that courage, loyalty, and respect for the sacred law were paramount. They also instilled fear and caution, ensuring that the rules of the tribe were respected and that defiance was met with serious consequences. Ritual, in this sense, was inseparable from education, governance, and the maintenance of social order. Anthropologists studying these practices have emphasized the importance of context. To interpret the cannibalistic rituals as mere savagery is to ignore the environmental pressures, spiritual beliefs, and social imperatives that shaped them. Scholars argue that acts we might consider horrifying were, in many ways, rational and adaptive. They reinforced identity, deterred outsiders, and maintained cohesion within a world where the line between life and death was tenuous and constantly tested. Understanding this context does not make the acts any less shocking to modern audiences, but it does reveal a complex system of meaning behind the terror, a framework that allowed the tribe to endure for generations despite extraordinary challenges. The rituals were also deeply intertwined with notions of honor and revenge. A slain enemy was not merely removed from the world. Their spirit was engaged, acknowledged, and, in a sense, respected through ceremonial consumption. To neglect this ritual was to risk spiritual imbalance, misfortune, and internal discord. In this way, cannibalistic feasts became instruments of both justice and continuity, reinforcing moral codes while simultaneously providing practical sustenance. The balance of fear, respect, and necessity created a culture in which acts of horror were simultaneously acts of devotion, survival, and social cohesion. Moreover, the tribe's isolation allowed these practices to persist relatively undisturbed for centuries. While outsiders occasionally encountered them, few had the means or the understanding to intervene. This seclusion fostered a sense of self-sufficiency and reinforced traditional practices, allowing ritual, mythology, and survival strategies to interweave seamlessly. Over time, the feasts became a central expression of cultural identity, a distinguishing feature that marked the tribe as both feared and revered in their region. The more remote and inhospitable the terrain, the more these rituals solidified, creating a cycle in which geography, belief, and social structure reinforced one another. By the time explorers and anthropologists documented these practices, the tribe's reputation had already grown into legend. Stories of terrifying feasts, ceremonial precision, and spiritual purpose spread through local communities and eventually into global consciousness. What had once been a practical, culturally embedded practice became a symbol of the exotic, the horrifying, and the fascinating. These narratives captured the imagination, inviting both revulsion and admiration, and cemented the tribe's place in the annals of history as one of the most mysterious and morally complex societies ever observed. In understanding the historical and cultural context of this tribe, it becomes clear that their cannibalistic rituals were not random acts of brutality. They were the product of centuries of adaptation, belief, and social organization, a response to a world of extremes where survival, honor, and spirituality were inseparable. By examining their environment, mythology, hierarchy, and interactions with outsiders, one begins to see a people who lived by rules both alien and strangely familiar, a people for whom death, reverence, and the act of consumption were intertwined in ways that challenge our understanding of morality, humanity, and the limits of cultural perspective. The cannibalistic feasts of the Andes tribe were not impulsive acts of savagery, but highly structured ceremonies, meticulously designed to honor tradition, assert power, and channel spiritual energy. To the tribe, these feasts were essential events, connecting the living with the dead and reinforcing the social and spiritual order. The preparation began long before the first drumbeat, with the body of a fallen enemy treated according to precise ritual codes. Warriors and elders carefully selected the victim based on bravery, strength, or significance, believing that consuming these qualities would enhance the tribe's collective power. Every detail, from positioning to method of preparation, carried symbolic weight. The ceremonial site was often secluded, chosen for its spiritual resonance and strategic isolation. As participants gathered, the air would thrum with tension and anticipation. Drums and chants reverberated through valleys, guiding the rhythm of the ritual and invoking the presence of ancestors. Smoke from fires mingled with the scent of herbs and burning offerings, creating an atmosphere thick with reverence and fear. Observers from outside the tribe often described the scene as simultaneously mesmerizing and terrifying, unable to reconcile the precision of the ceremony with its violent nature. The sensory intensity served a purpose. It focused the participants' minds, reinforced communal bonds, and heightened the spiritual potency of the feast. The process of preparing the body was itself a ritual, carried out with unwavering attention to tradition. Certain portions were allocated to specific members based on social rank, familial ties, or spiritual role. Cutting and cooking followed exact sequences, each movement deliberate, imbued with symbolic meaning. Elders oversaw every step, ensuring that the ceremonial rules were strictly observed. These procedures were not arbitrary. They reflected the tribe's understanding of life, death, and the transfer of spiritual power. Through these acts, the living absorbed the strength, courage, and wisdom of the fallen, reinforcing both individual and collective identity. When the consumption began, it was accompanied by chants, offerings, and prayers. The act of eating was not merely physical. It was a profound spiritual engagement. Warriors consumed their foes with deliberate intent, believing that each bite transferred the essence of the enemy into their own being. This was a moment of empowerment, connecting them to the spiritual realm and to the community's ancestral lineage. It was also a demonstration of social cohesion, teaching younger members the importance of ritual obedience, courage, and respect for tradition. The feasts reinforced hierarchy and identity, blending fear and reverence into a psychologically potent experience. The feasts served additional practical and strategic purposes. Consuming enemies removed threats while sending a powerful message to rivals. The tribe was united, disciplined, and spiritually invincible. The combination of spectacle and ritual created an aura of dominance, ensuring that outsiders approached with caution and respect. Within the tribe, the feasts reinforced moral and social codes, providing an outlet for aggression and a means to reward bravery. They were simultaneously acts of survival, education, spiritual practice, and communal reinforcement, a terrifyingly sophisticated system under the guise of horror. To modern observers, these feasts appear brutal and incomprehensible. Yet, for the tribe, every act carried profound meaning. The horror was inseparable from reverence, the violence inseparable from spirituality, and the fear inseparable from cohesion. Each ritual was a carefully balanced expression of power, belief, and survival, allowing a society isolated in harsh mountains to thrive under circumstances that would crush weaker communities. The cannibalistic feasts, in their ritualistic precision, reveal a people who transformed death into sustenance, fear into discipline, and horror into meaning, leaving a legacy that continues to both shock and fascinate. To understand the cannibalistic feasts of the Andes tribe, one must look beyond the physical act itself and examine the complex web of psychological motivations that sustain these rituals. At first glance, consuming an enemy might seem like sheer barbarism, an instinct born of cruelty or bloodlust. Yet, when seen through the lens of the tribe's culture, environment, and social structure, these acts were deeply rational, psychologically intricate, and bound to survival, honor, and spiritual belief. Human behavior, particularly in extreme environments, is shaped not only by necessity, but by the interplay of fear, respect, and social cohesion. These feasts reveal the dark and fascinating depths to which cultural psychology can stretch when shaped by life and death imperatives. The foundation of these psychological motivations lies in survival. The Andes are merciless, a landscape where food scarcity and harsh winters create constant pressure on human communities. Every resource is precious, and every act of planning or strategy can mean the difference between life and death. In this context, the consumption of an enemy served practical purposes beyond nutrition. It was a calculated method to reinforce the tribe's strength, to internalize the vitality of those who had been powerful enough to challenge them, and to ensure that resources did not fall into waste. Survival in such a harsh environment is not merely a physical challenge. It is a mental one, demanding a mindset where fear, discipline, and cunning intertwine. The feasts provided a framework in which these psychological traits were honed and reinforced. Fear, both of enemies and of the spiritual world, played a central role in shaping behavior. From childhood, members of the tribe were taught to respect the power of the dead, the dangers of rival groups, and the consequences of disobedience. Ritualized cannibalism was a mechanism through which fear became structured, channeled into obedience, and transformed into social cohesion. Warriors internalized the lessons of these feasts, understanding that the act of consuming a defeated enemy was not simply an assertion of dominance, but a spiritual and social imperative. Fear was never chaotic. It was disciplined, codified into the rhythm of ceremony and the expectations of the tribe. Through this lens, one begins to see the feasts as psychological training as much as spiritual practice, shaping the minds of participants in ways that ensured loyalty, courage, and focus. Another critical element was the need for identity and belonging. The tribe existed in isolation, surrounded by hostile terrain and potential enemies. In such conditions, communal identity becomes a powerful psychological force. Participating in a feast was a rite of passage, a declaration of loyalty, and a reaffirmation of the values that bound the group together. Each act of ritual consumption reinforced the individual's role within the social hierarchy and the collective ethos. By absorbing the strength of enemies, warriors internalized a symbolic form of power that connected them to the community, their ancestors, and the spiritual order. The feasts were both a mirror and a reinforcement of the tribe's psychological structure, ensuring that each member understood their place, purpose, and responsibility. Revenge and justice were also potent motivators. Within the tribe's worldview, violence was not random. It was calibrated according to principles of honor, retribution, and cosmic balance. An enemy killed in battle was not simply a body. They were a transgressor whose death demanded acknowledgement. Consuming the enemy symbolized the ultimate reckoning, turning fear and aggression into structured, socially sanctioned acts. This psychological mechanism allowed the tribe to channel natural human impulses, anger, fear, and desire for dominance, into controlled, ritualized expression. The feasts provided an outlet that reinforced moral and spiritual laws, while simultaneously reinforcing the tribe's cohesion and authority. The consumption of enemies also served as a profound spiritual act, linking psychology to belief. The tribe believed that the essence of the enemy, strength, courage, knowledge, could be transferred through ingestion. This belief created a psychological framework in which horror was transformed into empowerment. The act of eating was not merely survival. It was a deliberate, conscious engagement with forces beyond the physical world. Participants felt the weight of responsibility, the thrill of power, and the spiritual significance of their actions. In this sense, the feasts were as much a mental and emotional exercise as they were a physical one, shaping participants' perceptions of life, death, and human potential. Social reinforcement magnified the psychological impact. The presence of elders, spiritual leaders, and peers created an environment of accountability and observation. Participants internalized the expectations and rituals of the group, learning to navigate complex layers of hierarchy, fear, and belief. The psychological pressure to conform, coupled with the tangible rewards of status, honor, and spiritual approval, ensured that the rituals perpetuated themselves across generations. These feasts were not isolated events. They were ongoing lessons in morality, survival, and cultural identity, training the mind as rigorously as any warrior's combat or hunter's preparation. Finally, the psychological impact on outsiders cannot be ignored. Explorers and missionaries who witnessed or heard accounts of the feasts often reacted with terror, fascination, and disbelief. These reactions, in turn, reinforced the tribe's perception of power and spiritual authority. Psychological dominance was not only internal but external. The tribe's rituals projected fear and awe to those beyond their borders, creating a reputation that deterred rivals and reinforced isolation. In this way, the feasts were strategic, both psychologically and socially, asserting control over internal dynamics and external perceptions simultaneously. In examining the psychological motivations behind the cannibalistic feasts, one sees a society shaped by fear, survival, honor, and belief. The rituals reveal a sophisticated understanding of human behavior, a structure in which horror becomes meaningful, violence becomes ordered, and every act is intertwined with community, spirituality, and identity. The feasts were not chaotic. They were deliberate, adaptive, and psychologically potent, a testament to the tribe's ability to navigate extremes of human experience. Understanding these motivations does not diminish the horror for modern audiences, but it illuminates the intricate ways in which human psychology, culture, and survival instincts intersect to produce practices that, while shocking, are coherent within their own context. The Andes tribe's cannibalistic rituals, viewed through this lens, become more than a story of terror. They are a case study in the power of human psychology to shape behavior in extreme environments, the ways in which belief systems govern action, and the extraordinary lengths to which communities will go to preserve identity, enforce justice, and survive. Fear, honor, spiritual obligation, and survival imperatives converged in these feasts, creating a psychological landscape as intricate, haunting, and compelling as the mountains themselves. The remoteness of the Andes allowed the tribe to practice their rituals largely undisturbed for centuries, but occasional encounters with outsiders dramatically shaped both perception and history. These outsiders, explorers, missionaries, and rival tribes, often arrived with fear, curiosity, or the ambition to impose their own moral framework on a world they scarcely understood. To these visitors, the tribe's rituals were incomprehensible, horrifying, and undeniably fascinating, a stark contrast to anything they had ever seen. The tension between the tribe's internal logic and the outsider's perceptions created stories that would echo for generations, casting the feasts as both terrifying spectacles and objects of scholarly intrigue. When explorers first stumbled upon these ceremonies, they were often unprepared for the sensory and emotional intensity of what they witnessed. The Andes, with its mist-covered peaks and shadowed valleys, already set a stage of isolation and danger. Then came the rhythmic beating of drums, the haunting chants of the tribe, and the sight of warriors performing acts that outsiders described in both awe and revulsion. Reports from journals and letters detail the mixture of fascination and horror. How the air seemed thick with smoke and anticipation. How silence fell suddenly as the body of a fallen enemy was carried to the ceremonial site. And how every movement of the participants was deliberate, purposeful, and suffused with ritual meaning. For outsiders, the experience was unforgettable, leaving a mark that was part terror, part fascination. Missionaries often approached these encounters with a sense of moral duty, believing that the tribe needed to be saved from their supposedly savage practices. Their accounts, however, were colored by fear, judgment, and cultural bias. They struggled to reconcile the humanity of the tribe with acts they considered unthinkable. Many wrote of feeling paralyzed by the spectacle, torn between the instinct to intervene and the recognition that these acts were deeply ingrained within the tribe's spiritual and social fabric. Their journals are filled with conflicting emotions, terror at the physical realities of the feasts, and reluctant admiration for the precision, discipline, and intensity of the rituals. These encounters often reinforced the outsider's perception of the tribe as exotic, fearsome, and morally alien. Explorers and anthropologists, though more focused on observation than conversion, also struggled to contextualize what they saw. They documented rituals with meticulous detail, attempting to understand patterns of behavior, social hierarchy, and the symbolic significance of each act. Yet, even with careful study, the rituals retained an aura of mystery. Outsiders recognized that the feasts were not senseless acts of violence, but could not fully grasp the spiritual logic that governed them. The repetition of these accounts over decades contributed to a dual perception of the tribe, as both terrifying cannibals and as a people whose culture was astonishingly complex, adaptive, and meaningful within its own context. Rival tribes who encountered these feasts experienced an entirely different dimension of fear and strategic calculation. In a world where territorial disputes, scarcity, and violence were common, the knowledge that a tribe practiced ritualistic cannibalism could act as a deterrent. Word of their feasts spread quickly, creating a psychological advantage that extended beyond the ceremonial site. Outsiders approaching the territory were often aware that any aggression could result not only in defeat, but in ritual consumption. This form of intimidation was both practical and symbolic, reinforcing the tribe's dominance and the seriousness of their cultural codes. Encounters were fraught with tension, sometimes leading to skirmishes, retreats, or strategic alliances, all of which were colored by the fear and respect inspired by the tribe's rituals. The psychological impact on outsiders cannot be overstated. Witnessing the feast challenged their moral assumptions, their understanding of human behavior, and even their perception of civilization itself. Many accounts describe feelings of paralysis, a mix of dread and fascination, and a creeping sense of inadequacy when confronted with practices that operated under completely different rules. For some, these encounters became life-defining moments, shaping careers in anthropology, history, or missionary work. For others, they were sources of trauma, nightmares, and lifelong fascination with the extremes of human behavior. The Andes tribe's rituals forced outsiders to confront uncomfortable truths about morality, cultural relativism, and the thin line between civilization and perceived savagery. Yet, encounters were not always hostile or fraught with fear. Some outsiders observed quietly, learning from the tribe, documenting rituals, and attempting to understand the logic and meaning embedded in every act. These encounters produced invaluable historical and anthropological records, preserving knowledge of practices that would eventually fade under the pressure of colonization, modernization, and social change. In these moments, the tribe's rituals were seen as artful, precise, and deeply meaningful, a far cry from the random horror imagined by those who never witnessed them firsthand. The feasts became a lens through which outsiders could explore questions of survival, power, belief, and the adaptability of human societies in extreme conditions. The encounters also highlight a recurring theme: the contrast between fear and fascination. Outsiders were repelled and drawn in equal measure, horrified by what they saw yet unable to look away. The feasts forced a confrontation with the unknown, challenging assumptions about morality, culture, and human behavior. Through these encounters, the tribe's rituals were immortalized in history, not only as acts of horror, but as evidence of humanity's capacity for complex social and spiritual systems under extreme environmental and social pressures. Ultimately, the encounters with outsiders reveal the delicate balance between observation and misunderstanding, between terror and admiration. They show how cultural practices, no matter how alien, can inspire both horror and fascination. The Andes tribe's feasts were not merely acts of consumption. They were performances, statements of power, and manifestations of belief, all observed through eyes that could not fully comprehend the depth of meaning. These moments, recorded in journals, letters, and oral histories, preserve the tension, drama, and psychological complexity of the rituals, ensuring that the story of the tribe's encounters with the outside world remains both terrifying and endlessly compelling. Through these interactions, history captured the tribe at the intersection of fear, reverence, and misunderstanding. Outsiders documented a world that was simultaneously horrifying and beautiful, chaotic and meticulously ordered, violent and profoundly meaningful. Their accounts reveal the power of the Andes tribe's rituals to inspire awe, fear, and fascination, demonstrating that the impact of the feasts extended far beyond the ceremonial site, shaping perception, memory, and the enduring legacy of one of history's most mysterious and morally complex societies. The cannibalistic rituals of the Andes tribe, once central to their identity and survival, did not endure indefinitely. Over time, external pressures began to erode the practices that had defined generations. Colonization, the expansion of missionary influence, and the intrusion of modern societies into previously isolated valleys disrupted the delicate balance of tradition, belief, and survival. These forces, often uncomprehending of the tribe's worldview, imposed new moral, social, and legal frameworks, gradually suppressing the feasts and the spiritual systems that supported them. What had once been a coherent and sacred practice became a relic, remembered in stories, myths, and fragmented historical accounts. The arrival of colonial authorities marked the first major wave of disruption. Soldiers, bureaucrats, and settlers sought to impose control over remote regions, bringing with them new systems of governance, punishment, and law. Rituals that had been sanctioned by centuries of tribal authority were suddenly criminalized. Acts that had once been celebrated as demonstrations of bravery, honor, and spiritual power were recast as atrocities in the eyes of outsiders. Fear of punishment, combined with the practical consequences of contact with dominant societies, forced the tribe to abandon, or at least conceal, their most visible and shocking rituals. Over time, secrecy replaced ceremonial openness, and the feasts faded from daily practice, preserved only in the memories of elders and the whispered stories of surviving families. Missionaries played a particularly influential role in this decline. They arrived with a determination to civilize and convert, bringing education, religion, and moral codes that were fundamentally at odds with the tribe's traditional worldview. The missionaries condemned ritualistic cannibalism as sinful, immoral, and antithetical to their own religious teachings. Converts were often persuaded to abandon participation in feasts, and children were raised with new ethical frameworks that rejected violence and ritualized consumption. While some tribal members resisted, the psychological and social pressure exerted by missionaries created a generational shift. The acts that had once defined courage, honor, and spiritual duty slowly lost their legitimacy within the community, replaced by beliefs aligned with external authority rather than internal tradition. The decline was also accelerated by exposure to modernity and changing survival conditions. With the introduction of agriculture, trade, and access to external food sources, the practical necessity of consuming enemies diminished. Scarcity, once a driving force behind ritualized cannibalism, was mitigated through new means, weakening one of the fundamental justifications for the feasts. As survival became less dependent on extreme measures, the psychological, social, and spiritual imperatives that had sustained the rituals began to erode. What remained were the stories, memories, and legends, preserved in oral tradition and later documented by historians, anthropologists, and travelers who sought to capture a vanishing world. Despite the decline, the legacy of the feasts endured in profound ways. The rituals had shaped the tribe's identity for centuries, instilling values of courage, cohesion, and reverence for life and death. Even as the physical practices disappeared, the psychological and cultural imprint remained. The stories of the feasts, retold with awe, horror, and admiration, served as a bridge between past and present, allowing descendants to retain a connection to their ancestors and their beliefs. These narratives became a source of fascination for outsiders as well, shaping historical understanding and popular imagination about the tribe and their extraordinary customs. The tribe's interactions with outsiders during the period of decline further complicated their legacy. Explorers, anthropologists, and journalists recorded the remnants of rituals, often emphasizing the shock value over the nuanced cultural meaning. Their accounts immortalized the cannibalistic feasts as symbols of fear, horror, and exoticism, shaping the global perception of the tribe for generations. While this sensationalism sometimes overshadowed cultural context, it also ensured that the tribe's practices remained part of historical consciousness, providing modern audiences with a glimpse into the extremes of human behavior and the complex interplay between survival, ritual, and belief. In contemporary times, historians and anthropologists have revisited these stories, seeking to understand the feasts within their full historical and cultural context. They emphasize that the rituals were not random acts of violence, but were deeply embedded in a worldview shaped by geography, scarcity, spiritual belief, and social structure. By analyzing the decline of these practices, scholars can trace how external pressures, moral imposition, and changing environmental conditions reshaped the tribe's society. The disappearance of the feasts highlights the fragility of cultural traditions when confronted with overwhelming external forces, yet it also underscores the enduring influence of memory, storytelling, and historical record in preserving human experience. The legacy of the feasts is thus both haunting and instructive. They serve as a reminder of the extremes of human behavior, the complexity of cultural morality, and the ways in which societies adapt to environmental, spiritual, and social pressures. The rituals are a testament to the tribe's resilience, ingenuity, and the intricate systems of belief that allowed them to navigate life and death in one of the harshest environments on Earth. At the same time, they challenge modern audiences to confront uncomfortable questions about morality, survival, and the relativity of cultural norms. Even today, the echoes of the cannibalistic feasts resonate in local folklore, historical texts, and popular imagination. They continue to captivate those fascinated by the intersection of horror, history, and human psychology. The stories of the feasts remind us that human behavior is shaped by context, environment, and belief, and that practices deemed shocking or immoral in one framework may carry profound meaning in another. Through decline, suppression, and the passage of time, the feasts endure not as acts performed in the present, but as symbols of a society that lived, struggled, and sought meaning in ways that both terrify and fascinate. Ultimately, the decline of the cannibalistic rituals did not erase their significance. Instead, it transformed them into a legacy, a lens through which the resilience, complexity, and adaptability of the Andes tribe can be studied and appreciated. They serve as a stark reminder that history is not simply a record of the past, but a narrative shaped by memory, interpretation, and context, a narrative in which horror and reverence coexist, and where the shadows of the past continue to shape our understanding of humanity in all its extremes. The story of the Andes tribe and their cannibalistic feasts lingers long after the mountains themselves fade into mist, leaving echoes of fear, fascination, and awe. As we reflect on their history, it becomes clear that the narrative is not simply one of horror or cruelty, but a story about the extremities of human survival, belief, and social cohesion. These rituals, shocking to the modern mind, were born from necessity, structured by tradition, and sustained by a worldview that linked the physical and spiritual realms in ways that are almost impossible for outsiders to fully comprehend. By examining the entirety of their existence, the mountains, the culture, the psychology, the rituals, and the encounters with outsiders, we gain a window into a society that navigated life and death with precision, reverence, and an unsettling brilliance. The feasts themselves, once central to survival and identity, offer a profound insight into the human capacity to adapt to extreme circumstances. In a world defined by scarcity, danger, and the constant presence of death, the tribe's methods of coping and preserving community cohesion were both practical and symbolic. Each ritualized act of consumption reinforced hierarchy, transmitted cultural knowledge, and affirmed spiritual beliefs. In this sense, the cannibalistic feasts were more than shocking spectacles. They were deliberate tools of social engineering, spiritual engagement, and survival strategy. Modern observers, conditioned by different moral frameworks, often fail to appreciate the depth of rationality and cultural significance behind these acts. Yet, it is precisely this dissonance, the horror we feel versus the cultural logic they followed, that makes their story compelling and endlessly haunting. History has recorded the tribe through the lens of outsiders, often with a mixture of terror, fascination, and misunderstanding. Missionaries, explorers, and anthropologists struggled to reconcile the humanity of the participants with the extremity of their rituals. Their accounts, though invaluable, reflect not only observation but also projection, moral judgment, and sensationalism. The tribe's cannibalistic practices were transformed into legends, emphasizing shock and exoticism over nuanced understanding. Yet, even within these accounts, glimpses of respect and awe emerge. Observers recognize the discipline, precision, and spiritual depth of the feasts, acknowledging that the tribe had created a complex system of ritual that integrated fear, reverence, and survival. This duality, the horror and the admiration, underscores the enduring fascination that these stories evoke. The decline of the rituals, driven by colonization, missionary influence, and societal change, did not erase their legacy. Instead, it transformed them into historical memory, folklore, and cultural reflection. The practices were gradually suppressed or abandoned, but the lessons embedded within them, about courage, cohesion, survival, and the human relationship with death, persisted in oral histories and later academic studies. For descendants and historians alike, these stories offer a bridge to the past, illuminating not only the extremities of human behavior, but also the adaptability of human societies when faced with environmental, spiritual, and social pressures. The tribe's rituals remind us that cultural practices, no matter how alien or shocking, emerge from specific contexts and should be understood in relation to the world that gave rise to them. Psychologically, the feasts reveal the intricate ways humans reconcile fear, morality, and spirituality. The act of consuming an enemy was simultaneously terrifying, empowering, and spiritually significant. Participants were trained to integrate these extreme experiences into their sense of self, their understanding of the community, and their relationship with the spiritual world. Fear was structured, channeled, and transformed into ritualized action, illustrating how deeply culture and environment shape human behavior. Modern audiences are often captivated by the horror, yet the more profound lesson lies in understanding the tribe's psychological sophistication, their ability to impose order, meaning, and spiritual coherence onto acts that might otherwise appear senseless. The Andes Mountains themselves remain silent witnesses to these histories, their peaks and valleys guarding secrets that few outsiders ever glimpsed. The isolation they provided shaped every aspect of tribal life, allowing rituals to flourish in secrecy, reinforcing identity, and preserving knowledge that was passed down for generations. Even as modernity encroached, the psychological and cultural imprint of these rituals persisted, highlighting the enduring power of environment in shaping human society. Geography, spirituality, and social structure coalesced into a system in which every act, however extreme, carried purpose, meaning, and consequence. In this sense, the story of the feasts is inseparable from the land itself. As we consider the tribe's encounters with outsiders, the duality of fear and fascination becomes even clearer. These rituals provoked terror, but they also commanded respect, revealing the tribe's mastery over both internal and external perception. Outsiders were drawn to the extremes of human behavior, compelled to witness, record, and interpret acts they could not fully comprehend. The stories that emerged from these encounters shaped global perception, embedding the Andes tribe into the broader narrative of human curiosity, horror, and historical study. The feasts became symbolic not only of ritualized consumption, but of the clash between worlds, one governed by ancestral tradition and the other by external moral codes. Ultimately, the story of the Andes tribe and their cannibalistic feasts forces a confrontation with human complexity. It challenges us to consider morality, survival, and belief not as universal constants, but as contextually bound phenomena. The horror and fascination they evoke are inseparable from our attempt to comprehend behavior born of extreme environmental pressures and deeply rooted spiritual systems. These rituals remind us that human societies can create frameworks of meaning around life, death, and community that defy outside judgment, yet retain coherence and purpose within their own context. The legacy of the tribe's rituals endures not only in historical texts and anthropological studies, but also in the psychological and cultural questions they provoke. They are reminders of human adaptability, the power of ritual, and the ways in which fear and reverence can coexist. They compel us to explore the boundaries of morality, the nature of belief, and the extremes to which communities will go to survive, honor the dead, and maintain cohesion. As shadows of the past mingle with the peaks and valleys of the Andes, these stories remain both haunting and instructive, offering a glimpse into a world where horror and meaning walk hand in hand, and where the human spirit is tested against the harshest of circumstances. In the end, the feasts of the Andes tribe are more than historical curiosities. They are a mirror reflecting the dark and complex potentials of humanity, a window into the extremes of survival, spirituality, and social cohesion. Their story lingers in memory, scholarship, and imagination, reminding us that history is rarely neat or simple. It is messy, morally ambiguous, and full of contradictions. And it is within these shadows that we find the most compelling tales, stories that force us to confront fear, empathy, and the astonishing depths of human behavior, leaving an indelible impression on the minds of all who dare to look closely.